This video explores one of the strangest details in Silo, the enormous gap between the supposedly modern origins of the silos and the primitive, brutalist society that eventually developed inside them. We'll look at the bunker-like architecture, the absence of elevators, the Pact symbols, and the mysterious poison pipes connected to safeguard. But more importantly, we'll explore the possibility that these things aren't random design choices at all. They may be pieces of one enormous system designed not simply to protect humanity, but to control it. And if you're obsessed with unraveling the mysteries of Silo, digging into the theories, hidden clues, and episode breakdowns every week, make sure you like, subscribe, and drop your theories in the comments. I make these videos all by myself, so your support really helps the channel. And most importantly, subscribe if you want to know what's really going on inside the silo. Because apparently, knowing the truth is dangerous. There is something deeply wrong with the way the silos look. And I don't mean the fact that they're underground, or that everything is made of concrete, or that the whole place looks like it was designed by someone who absolutely hated natural light. I'm talking about something much more specific. The silos are supposed to have been created by incredibly wealthy, technologically advanced people who had access to technology far beyond what the residents living inside eventually possessed. Yet, when you actually look at the world they've built, it doesn't feel futuristic. It feels ancient. It feels like a Soviet bunker that somehow survived the apocalypse. The walls are thick, the machinery looks industrial, the living spaces are brutally functional. People travel through enormous staircases instead of convenient modern transportation. Scientific knowledge is restricted, communication is limited, and everywhere you look, the architecture seems designed around survival rather than comfort. So here's the question I can't stop thinking about. Why would a modern technological billionaire build a future shelter that looks like this? And what if the answer is that the silos weren't actually designed to become the society we're seeing today? What if something happened between their construction and the world we know? Because once you start connecting these details, the architecture of the silos stops looking like background decoration. It starts looking like evidence. Let's start with the obvious problem. Imagine a billionaire in the modern era deciding to save humanity by constructing an enormous underground civilization. This person has access to advanced engineering, sophisticated computers, modern communications, and practically unlimited resources. Would you expect that person to build a city where one of the most important methods of transportation is walking up and down hundreds of levels of stairs? Probably not. And that's where the lack of elevators becomes surprisingly interesting. You could argue that elevators are vulnerable. They require maintenance, electricity, complex machinery, and potentially create a point of failure in a structure that is supposed to survive for generations. That's a reasonable explanation. But there's another possibility. Maybe the stairs aren't simply there because they're practical. Maybe they're there because they're useful. Think about what the staircase does to society. It physically separates people. If you're living hundreds of levels away from another department, getting there isn't a casual trip. Moving large groups of people becomes difficult. Communication between communities becomes slower. Different sections of the silo become isolated from each other. And that means the architecture itself can enforce social order. The silo doesn't need to tell everyone where they belong every second. The building does it for them. The upper levels, the middle levels, the mechanical areas, the farms, the mines, the administrative spaces, every part of society is physically separated. And suddenly, the silo starts looking less like a shelter and more like a machine designed to control human movement. That's important because the Pact does something very similar. The Pact doesn't simply establish laws, it establishes boundaries around knowledge. It determines what people are allowed to build, what they're allowed to investigate, what they're allowed to remember, and even what they're allowed to believe about the world outside. And that's where the architecture becomes even more suspicious, because the residents don't simply live in an old-looking building. They live in a society that has forgotten what modern civilization looked like. If the founders were capable of manipulating or erasing memories, then suddenly the technological regression inside the silo makes a lot more sense. Imagine removing the collective memory of smartphones, the internet, modern communications, advanced scientific equipment, and countless other technologies. Then imagine doing that across generations. Eventually, people wouldn't just lose the technology. They would lose the context necessary to understand that the technology ever existed. And that changes everything. Because the most effective way to prevent people from questioning their environment isn't necessarily to destroy every piece of advanced technology. It's to make sure nobody remembers why they should want it. That's a much more powerful form of control. And this could explain why the silo society feels so disconnected from the world that supposedly created it. The people living there may not be descendants who naturally developed this culture. They may be descendants who were deliberately conditioned into it. And that brings us to the Pact. Those strange symbols and decorations embedded into the concrete are easy to overlook, but think about what they represent. A civilization doesn't suddenly develop a deeply established symbolic culture overnight, especially not one that appears embedded directly into the architecture. If the silos were built by modern people, you would expect some trace of that original culture to survive. But instead, we see something that feels like the residents have inherited an entirely different civilization. So perhaps the Pact wasn't simply written after the silos were completed. Perhaps the entire culture was deliberately constructed. And if that's true, then the question becomes, who decided that the people inside the silos needed to live this way? This is where the theory gets much darker. Maybe the original purpose of the silos wasn't simply to give humanity somewhere safe to live. Maybe the silos were designed as controlled environments. Think about the ingredients. You have isolated communities, restricted information, limited technology, controlled movement, suppressed memories, strict rules surrounding the outside world.
And the government structure capable of enforcing all of it. That's not just a bunker, that's an experiment. The founders may have realized that keeping humanity alive underground would require more than concrete walls. It would require controlling human behavior. Because if you put thousands of people underground and simply tell them, good luck, eventually somebody is going to question the system. Someone will want to leave. Someone will want to know what happened. So what happens then? That's where the poison pipes become one of the most disturbing pieces of the puzzle. Safeguard is essentially a reset button. If an entire silo becomes dangerous enough, the system can potentially eliminate the population. And that raises a terrifying question. Why would anyone designing a refuge for humanity build something capable of killing everyone inside it? The obvious answer is that the founders anticipated failure. They anticipated rebellion. They anticipated contamination. They anticipated a situation where one silo could become dangerous to everyone else. But there's another possibility. Maybe Safeguard wasn't originally created as a punishment. Maybe it was designed as a containment system. If the silos were connected in some larger experiment or survival strategy, an infected or compromised population could potentially threaten others. So the ability to eliminate an entire silo might have been considered necessary. And that tells us something important about the people who designed this world. They weren't simply planning for humanity to survive. They were planning for humanity to become uncontrollable. And that might be the real reason the silos feel so oppressive. We're looking at a civilization designed by people who were afraid of what humans could do when given too much freedom. That's why the architecture matters. The concrete isn't just protecting people from the outside, it's trapping them. The staircase isn't just connecting floors, it's separating communities. The Pact isn't just providing laws, it's controlling knowledge. The memory technology isn't just treating people, it's controlling history. And Safeguard isn't just an emergency system, it gives the people in power the ultimate form of control, the ability to erase an entire population. Now there's another possibility that makes all of this even more interesting. What if the silos didn't begin exactly the way they ended? What if the original project was interrupted? The theory suggests that perhaps the silos were constructed during a period of impending catastrophe, and control over the project changed hands. Maybe the people who originally designed them had one vision. Then something happened. An attack, a global catastrophe, a collapse of governments, a military intervention, something that forced the project to change. The luxurious, technologically advanced refuse that might have been imagined at the beginning could have been transformed into something much more authoritarian. And suddenly, the brutalist architecture makes more sense. The silos weren't necessarily designed to make people feel comfortable. They were designed to survive. And eventually, survival became the only thing that mattered. That could also explain why the society inside feels so disconnected from its origins. The people who built the silos may have disappeared. The people who took control may have rewritten the rules. And generations later, nobody remembers that the system was ever different. That's the truly horrifying part. The residents might believe the silo has always been this way. But what if it hasn't? What if they're living inside the remains of a completely different project? A project whose original purpose has been buried beneath generations of propaganda, memory suppression, and controlled history. And this brings us back to the biggest question. Why would the founders be so afraid of the people living inside the silos? Because maybe the greatest threat wasn't the outside world. Maybe it was human nature. Perhaps the founders believed that if humanity was ever given the same technology, freedom, and knowledge that helped destroy the old world, history would simply repeat itself. So they created something radically different. A civilization where people couldn't easily travel, couldn't easily communicate, couldn't freely access knowledge, couldn't remember the world that came before, and couldn't simply walk outside whenever they wanted. In other words, they didn't just build a shelter, they built a civilization where rebellion itself would be difficult to organize. And if that's the real purpose behind the silos, then the primitive appearance isn't a plot hole, it's the point. The silo was never meant to feel like the future. It was meant to feel like a controlled version of humanity's past. A place where people could survive without ever becoming powerful enough to destroy themselves again. And that changes how we should look at every concrete wall, every staircase, every pact symbol, every restriction, and every piece of technology inside this world. Because maybe the silos aren't old because the builders lacked technology. Maybe they're old because someone deliberately wanted them to look and function this way. And if that's true, then the biggest mystery isn't what happened to the world outside. It's what happened to the people who built the world inside. Because somewhere in the history of the silos, there may have been a moment when humanity stopped building a sanctuary and started building a prison.